You're listening to the 95Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches. Welcome, everybody, to the 95 Podcast. My name is Carolee Culpepper, and I'm here with our Executive Director, Dale Sellers. Dale, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing really good because you're here.
Oh, thanks.
I'm so excited. This is our first official podcast. Now that Austin has he's ridden off into the sunset now. And so, you know, with his business and it doing so well. And so everybody who listened to the last podcast knows what I'm talking about. But I'm so excited to have you here to be part of our team. Actually, some of my friends heard the podcast that we did, and one of them said that the podcast was going to get a much wider audience now that you're here. And so I'm beginning to wonder, did he think that it was really that bad before? Or what's the deal?
No, absolutely not. No, but I hope it does great.
What was your what is your morning routine like when at Carolee's house every day? Because you got two little ones.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's see. We get up, get everybody up as well, get dressed, eat breakfast, you know, just the normal hustle and bustle. So thankfully my husband's really good about helping out. So
how old are those little ones?
We kind of divide and conquer. Foster is 3 and Nora is 6. So
they don't have any trouble getting started in the day, do they?
Oh, it just depends. It really just depends, but they're pretty good about getting up. But you know, yep. Just kind of crazy there for a little while until we can get everybody off to school.
Yeah. We've got a 4-year-old granddaughter and then a 9-month-old grandson. And so we understand what it's like. Well, anyway, I'm so glad you're here. I'm glad you're part of the team. And I'm also today excited that we have a couple other folks who are part of the team as well that are going to be part of this podcast. I've got some specific things I want to talk about as we move forward. But today we have Jon Sanders with us and Jason Allison. They're both part of the 95 Network team, but they also do some other things as well. So gentlemen, welcome. Glad you're here. Welcome today.
Thank you.
Hey,
glad
guys.
to be here.
John, take a few minutes. I know a lot of our audience knows who you are, but for someone who may not know who you are, tell a bit about who you are, what you do, and then Jason, why don't you do the same thing?
Yeah, I'll try and make it very brief. I have been in and around pastoral ministry my entire life. I grew up in a pastor's home, loved it. Wasn't for me, though. I was not going to be a pastor. I was very adamant about that, and God had other plans for my life. He called me out of a career in the fire service and into church planting, and moved us to a little rural community in South Dakota, which is necessary to put the word rural in front of anything in South Dakota because it's all rural. But anyway, we planted a church. It grew over the years into a multi-site church in multiple rural locations. And somewhere along that journey started a podcast for rural church people called the Small Town Big Church Podcast. Basically, the big idea is we serve a God who wants to do big things in small places. Like, God is not disappointed in the relatively small number that's on the little population sign on the edge of your community. And, that podcast has over the years opened the doors for some really cool opportunities for influence and networking with leaders all across the country, and just to be a part of church conversations. And so today what I'm doing is really went full time with the podcast and coaching. I'm no longer in the lead pastor role after 17 years in that seat. I stepped back from that back in 2020, right before the pandemic blew up. So that was great timing there to step out and not lead through all of that. But now I spend my days, I'm back in full-time firefighting, but in addition to that, when I'm not at the station, I spend my days having powerful conversations with church leaders and creating content for my podcast and all of that. So that's just kind of the elevator pitch as we're heading up the building there.
Well, the other thing I love about it too is that you didn't mention this, but I hold you in high regard because of this. You're the guy that I went pheasant hunting with last week.
Amen. Yes.
And I always wanted a pheasant hunt, and John got me hooked up last year. And so I went last year, went this year, and I've already booked the trip for next year. So
Amen.
You will always be on my heart for that specific reason. And then this next guy has a special place in my heart too, because one, we did coaching before I worked at 95 Network. But he also hosted the very first 95 Network one-day conference. And so, Jason, kind of welcome to give everybody the backstory of Jason Allison.
Well, sure. Kind of the opposite of John. I did not grow up in a pastor's home. I grew up in a Christian home, but it wasn't my dad.
So is that a difference?
Sometimes it is. No, my dad helped start a Christian school and worked at another one later. And so, I grew up in and around stuff like that. But yeah, I was planning to be an accountant and do stuff like that. But when I was a senior in high school, felt a call to ministry and ended up changing my life course, so to speak, and went into the ministry and have been in there for almost 30 years now, in one way, shape, or form. I was at a church plant where I came in about 18 months into the plant and was the number 2 guy, so to speak, for about 8 years. And that church grew to a pretty large church. And out of that, they sent me to plant a church just north of Columbus, Ohio. And so about 15 years ago, I moved and started a church here in Central Ohio and did that for about 12 years. And then recently, we ended up merging with another church that was going to plant. And out of that, we now have 2 campuses that we're developing. Of course, we launched all that. John, unlike you got out as the pandemic started. We decided to launch in the middle of the pandemic.
Good move.
So that's been fun, to say the least. But yeah, so we're now a year into this new church plant that has a campus where I was the lead pastor, but now I'm the pastor of spiritual formation for Press Church. Yes, that sounds really, really like official and spiritual. Mm-hmm. Basically, I'm the guy that does all the stuff no one else knows how to do. And yeah, in the midst of that, I also am employed by Converge Mid-Atlantic, which is our denominational affiliation. I'm the director of church strengthening for our district. And so with that, I get to travel around and spend some time with churches and get to know pastors and leadership teams, and have been able to see some really cool things happening in that, especially in the midst of the pandemic. But yeah, Dale, you hold a special place in my heart because, several years ago when I reached out to then the Unstuck group, who offered me a special deal on coaching, and then I guess because it was a bargain, they assigned you to me. And
you can take that however you want.
Yeah, you can take that a lot of ways. But no, I when we started talking, you really not only saved my ministry. I think there's a part of it where you probably saved my sanity in a lot of ways, and just gave me a person who actually cared for me, not because I was productive or successful, but because I was me, and that has meant a lot to me over the years. And so I am honored to be on the podcast with you.
Well, I'm so thankful to have both of you on the team. Jon and Jason both help us in coaching and conferences and vision days and things like that. And it's great to have seasoned guys like you as part of the team. Both of you use the word church plant as part of your story. And so I want to take a stab at this and just kind of would you just kind of give us your definition of what it means to be a church planter? Jason, go ahead and give us yours. And then Jon, you just kind of piggyback off of that.
A church planter is someone who goes into a community and starts a new community of people that we call a church. They begin with nothing from scratch and build on it. So in its basis form, it's a new church that didn't exist before. This person comes in and helps develop a team and a mission and a vision, and they launch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess all I would add to that is it takes us a unique skill set or gifting or a certain type of wiring to be drawn to that, because the word entrepreneur comes to my mind. It's really where your kingdom entrepreneurs are. For years, I wrestled with that. I didn't realize, I always, thought I was a pastor, but I struggled with that identity, if you will. It hasn't been until later years that I've really identified about myself. I'm more of an entrepreneur, and I can look back and see how God used that entrepreneurial wiring that has always been a part of my life. I just wasn't always aware of it, but how God used that in my church planting story, because it takes a special kind of crazy to come and start something out of nothing, to try and build a church where there is not one. Not everybody's wired for that. So I didn't know that when I first got started in all this. I thought this is something anyone can do and everyone should do. And I've since come to realize, no, probably not. It's not for everyone. And it does take a unique gifting and some skill sets to go in and be a church planter.
Well, your natural bent too, Jon, just with the personality like you have. I mean, you guys are both two different personalities. You're more of the entrepreneurial kind, and Jason, you're more of the numbers guy based on your backstories. But both of you were willing to do church planting, and that's kind of what I want to get into today. Jason and I were having breakfast together. He went with me to State College a few weeks ago, or to Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. We did a couple of conferences together, and we're having breakfast one morning, and he starts telling me about an organization. I don't remember which one it was, but I've heard of this story again since then, that these organizations that are church planters are just really, really, really trying to plant churches. I mean, just like rapidly plant churches because they want to catch up with or the concept is they want to catch up with the population growth. And as we began to talk about that, I began to have some flags about it. And that's kind of why I wanted to have this conversation today. I don't know a lot about church planting. I do know that I want to be, 95 Network wants to be there to assist those who do plant churches, because we believe the structural things that we teach are very important there. But it just seems to me like there needs to be some preparation and planning in church planting that I'm not sure that's happening right now. Either one of you guys got any thoughts about that?
Go ahead, Jon. How were you trained, Jon? Because I don't know how you were prepped to be a church planter.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did not go, I guess, a traditional, or is there a traditional route for being trained for church planting? I don't know. If there is, I didn't take that route. So let's just put that out there, because I didn't,
that's the point of today. That's what that's one of the things I want to dive into. Is there a traditional route? Or we, I know some churches, like, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know some churches, like, if you're going to be a missionary, there's like a 2-year process to be a missionary. But if churches are rapid fire putting out, if organizations are rapid fire putting out church plants right now, my concern is we're setting people up for failure. So kind of now dive back in.
Yeah. So here's what I'll say. My pathway into ministry was kind of a non-traditional one based on what we've defined as a traditional path into ministry. I did not go to Bible college and seminary. God called me into pastoral ministry out of quote unquote secular career. I'm using air quotes for the audio audience that can't see me. But I don't believe there's such thing as a secular career, but God called me out of the fire service into church planting. So here's a big principle I will share as far as training goes. In my opinion, and my understanding is that churches produce church planters, not Bible colleges or seminaries. I think the best place to train church planters is in the church. And so I did get that. I mean, I don't have a degree, a diploma hanging on my wall saying that I'm, certified to plant churches, but I had an active involvement in the life of my local church that most of it was very informal. There was not like a formal church planting track that I was a part of. But by the time I was sent out as a church planter, I really feel like I had the support of my church family behind me and other churches at that point. And for me personally, too, I had grown up, I kind of had that inside view of growing up in a pastor's home. So I kind of saw the church through that lens of church leadership my entire life. So a lot of my training was more caught, if you will, than taught. But Dale, your general premise, I'm with you on that. I think that, I'm all for church planting. You're not going to hear me say, no, I don't think we should be planting churches. But I also think there should be some level of intentionality around the training. And I have another thought, a big thought too, I want to share about the motivation behind church planting, but maybe we'll get into that further in the conversation. So I'll kick it back to Jason.
Well, and that really is, I was in a church plant that exploded in a good way.
I'm sorry.
No, it was good. Literally the guy who planted that church was my youth pastor, was a dear friend, and he went to Dallas Seminary and got a degree in church planting. So like he was, studied under Aubrey Malfers, all this stuff, all the pedigrees that you're supposed to have. Well, then they assumed that since I had served 8 years there, that I would just automatically know how to do church planting. and so that it was kind of like you, it was caught, not taught, for me at least. And yet I felt after everything was said and done, once I launched and so forth, I realized how, ill prepared I really was to launch a new church and to understand all of the ins and outs of that. And that's where, for me at least, it became an issue of, wow, I don't know that I really was trained in a way that I could start something from scratch. I mean, I had a degree in theology with a minor in ancient languages. I mean, that's just really exciting and riveting. But that and $2.65 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So
Jason, I can't tell you how often in life, in a rural community, when I'm uptown at the bakery or getting gas, how that comes up in conversation, questions I get from the community about ancient languages. It's a common thing. Rural people are very concerned about the ancient Greek and Hebrew.
Maybe that can be our next podcast episode.
Well, I agree. Nobody told me that when I was in college, though. So I did, at least my master's is in practical ministry. So I did try to make it somewhat usable. But yeah, in all that, I learned how to be part of a ministry, but to lead one and to start something from scratch. I agree with you, John. That is a whole different skill set. And there are people who are gifted in that, who, whether they're doing it in, as you use the air quote, secular world, or the Christian realm, either way, it's a gifting and a wiring that people have, and it's different.
Can I ask a question of Jason? Can I step into the host role for just a second?
We're just along for the ride.
Jason, so where did you feel you were lacking when you got started in church planting? Like, what are some examples of things where you felt, man, I wasn't prepared for this?
Well, I didn't really understand what it was to have a true mission and vision that grew out of me. I knew how to create one, but it wasn't really this burning thing in my heart that I had to do. It was more, well, I'm supposed to do this, and here's the right three answers. And, so no one ever really asked for my why, why are you doing this? And so honestly, if at first someone had asked me that, it would have been, well, because I want to be the opposite of what I just saw. It wasn't because I know exactly what God is calling me to do. So there's that. I wasn't, I feel like I didn't have the pastoral training of what it meant to lead a new group of people toward a mission. I had been part of that, but no one had really walked me through what that meant. I mean, that's part of why I do what I do now, is I try to catch these leaders and say, hey, let me let you not make the same mistakes I did, and understand who people are and how to read people and understand how they fit within the community, and move forward.
Yeah, that's good. So much of the conversations that I have with pastors from a coaching perspective, it's that kind of stuff. It's the practical nuts and bolts that they don't get in seminary, and again, I'm not against Bible college or seminary, but if that's your only training for ministry, you are woefully unprepared coming out of there for the practical leadership challenges that will be faced. And so again, in my early days, that was such a point of insecurity in my life that I didn't have that. I didn't feel like I belonged in that world of being a pastor because I didn't have the pedigree and all the letters behind my name. And it was just a huge point of insecurity. I was young, but looking back, what I realized is that, man, I learned some stuff along the way about leadership and working with people and just some of those practical things. I'm not saying I was prepared with all of that either, but maybe had a little bit more working knowledge of it without even realizing it, just because of my role serving in the local church for years, coming up in that and leading volunteer projects and teams and some of that. Like, I had some of that experience and didn't realize that God would use that in a church planting role. So one other quick thought that I want to say to your thing, Jason, you kind of hit on this. It's a big thing. I don't want it to be missed in this conversation about church planting. I believe many churches get planted out of a spirit of rebellion. Jason, when you talked about, someone saying, man, I don't know what I'm doing. I just know it's not going to look like where I came from. I just challenge anybody that is wanting to plant a church, make sure that you are someone who is under authority, who knows how to be, yielded to spiritual leadership and authority. Because if you're planting a church out of a spirit of rebellion, I just don't believe God's going to bless that. I think there's been many churches that have rebellion sewn into the DNA of the very beginning of the church, because it's in the heart of the church planter that's walking away from something that refuses to be under authority and under leadership. So he says, well, I'll just go start my own church. And again, I'm all for church planting. I'm not for rebellious church planting. So I just wanted to make sure that got thrown out there.
John, I have a question about that. What was your motivation in planting your church, your first church? And what do you think are some constructive and good motivations for other people that are thinking about planting a church?
Yeah, I'll just tell a brief bit of my story. It's totally anecdotal, so this is not authoritative for you. This is just my story. So my motivation, I can honestly tell you, God called me to it. I did not want to do it, at least initially. I resisted it. I ran from it. The story of how we got connected with our little community here in South Dakota, for years, our church back in Illinois supported an elderly gentleman that was a missionary to the Santee Sioux Native American tribe here in Flandreau. And we would send teams up every summer on a little missions trip and run a day camp for kids. And my wife and I came on that trip many years as teenagers. And this elderly gentleman would always say, he would say, pray that God would send someone to Flandreau to start a church here and to really build on this foundation. And so I made the mistake of saying, dear Lord, please send someone to Flandreau to start a church. And God answered that prayer. And he's like, hey, John, I have a guy. How about you? And that is not what I asked for. I said, God, send somebody. And he sent me. So for me, it truly was a calling. I ran from it. I did my best to say, God, please let me do anything but that. And finally I surrendered. And by the way, my only regret in all of that, I wish I just would have surrendered sooner, because God always writes way cooler stories with our life than we do.
Right.
But for me, it was a calling that I did not desire to be a pastor or a church planter. None of that sounded like sexy to me. So anyway, that's just me. So take from that what you will. But I guess if I had to summarize it, Carolee, I would say this: unless God is calling you to plant a church, for crying out loud, don't go plant a church. Make sure God's leading and calling, and it's truly something you can't escape. And if you can escape it, by all means, go do something else. Amen. Go ahead, Jason.
It's funny because my experience of that call was very similar, in that I was leading a group of pastors in Central Ohio, and our job from the denomination was to identify the next area that needed a church plant, where we should go about doing it. And, I was sitting in this meeting, and we couldn't find anyone that could do it. And I finally said, well, guys, what do you think? Where should we do it? And they mentioned the Delaware, Ohio, which is right outside of Columbus. And actually my wife is the one who even mentioned that earlier, because her sister lived there. And she said, they need a good church there. There aren't any. And so I'd been working with this group, and they started describing what that church planter should look like. And I remember we were in this bed and breakfast, and I'm just sitting there, and inside I hear God saying, it's you, stupid. You're the one who needs to go do this. And so I just didn't tell anyone that, and I said, you know what, I'll pray about this in 3 months. Like, if I'm still thinking about it in 3 months. So I literally had one of those day timers. Do you remember the actual pen and paper day timers? And I wrote that was in January. So I wrote 3 months later, I said, pray about church planning. And I went home and told my wife, I said, well, this came up. I don't know. We're not going to do anything yet. And she said, well, when I mentioned that someone should plant a church there, I really thought it was you. I said, well, you could have told me that before, I get all this going. So
just for those that are just for those that are taking notes at home, just know, if you're having a bad day, Jesus called Peter Satan, and he called Jason stupid. So I want you to know that, in case you're feeling bad about yourself.
I think it's very interesting that both of you guys felt called and tried to kind of get away from that before you finally surrendered to that.
Listen, Carolee, and again, forgive me if I'm out of line in saying this, but I don't trust a pastor who wanted to do that. Like, I want to follow someone who didn't want the job and surrendered, that's just me. Like, I know there's some great pastors who wanted to do it since they were young, but man, I grew up in it. So I'm like, anybody who voluntarily signs up for this is Man. So anyway, I trust someone
hear that.
who tried to get out of it.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit. So, what are some wrong motives for wanting to pastor a church? And I do want to come back to something you said earlier, John. If you start a church with the wrong motive, that's also called a church split.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, where I live in South Carolina, in this area of the country, I don't even know if there's a way to know the amount, but I'm sure it's more than 50%. I think it's probably much higher, like 80% of the churches in our area started as church splits. So we're not, when we talk about church planning, we're not talking about a church split, because what I believe, and you said it, John, and you're the only other person I've ever heard say this, but I believe that when you start as a split, you have splitting in your DNA.
Yep.
I just believe, and not that you can't overcome it, but I do believe to overcome it, you have to go back and make things right with the people you split from. Because I mean, Jesus, when he was in the garden praying and sweat and blood, and his whole passion, his whole prayer there was that we'd be unified, we'd be one. And so when you guys think about it, what are some impure motives, maybe? And I hate to say impure because I'm not talking about sin. Wrong motives is the best way to say it. What are some wrong motives for starting a church or church planting? You got anything that would just pop in your head?
I do.
Go
ahead. I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Well,
so
I mean,
well,
go ahead,
buddy.
buddy.
No, you're already a podcast host, so they expect that, so that's fine.
well, I mean, John, you probably have seen this before, but I mean, especially in a denominational setting, when there's this push to plant churches, and there's almost a strong arming of,
yes,
every youth pastor ought to be thinking about this, and you kind of get guilted into it. To me, that's one bad motive when you're doing it, because it just feels like, well, I'm supposed to, or it's the next step in my ministry career. Those are areas that I have seen. I've done enough assessment centers where I've listened to potential church planners talk about their call and how really it was just, I thought I should, or I'm going to give it a try because I like to start things. That's not a good motivation.
Yeah, that's good. One other thing I would add, we've already covered the kind of the rebellious heart that might be a motivation for some. The other is this, and I wrote about this in my book, Dale. I just call it an unhealthy like codependency. This isn't just for church planting. I would just put this to pastoral ministry as a whole. There is something about that role, that position as a pastor, that if you have this need to be needed, that's a great spot for an unhealthy, incomplete, emotionally unstable person. I know a lot of pastors that ministry feeds that, and that's not good. It's unhealthy, it's toxic, and they need to get some deep counseling and healing in their life to get over that need to be needed, because I've never seen that lead a pastor to a healthy place. I've seen that lead to a lot of crashing and burning in ministry and moral failure. But there's something about how we've kind of set up the pastorate and that platform where it's like, man, you get those strokes of the ego when man, pastor, I need you to be the one to come and pray with me or be with me in the hospital or speak into my life in this. So again, that's deep, but that needs to be looked at as someone is getting into ministry. Like, are you whole? Are you emotionally healthy? And do you have some people speaking into your life that know you and you're accountable to, that can kind of point some of that stuff out? So that would be another thing I would add.
Dale, I really feel like you should have written a book that involves a chapter on needing to be needed, because, I don't think you have. Oh, wait. Yeah, you did. That's right. That was also a chapter in your book. But, John, I think I resonate with that probably far too much. That's part of the reason, I think. And I wished that someone would have done some more digging into my life before, so that could have been rooted out before I launched into it. And like you said too, that could show itself whether you're planting a church or just the pastor of a church.
Right.
That's just an unhealthy, posture, no matter where you're at.
And something I'll say, to be fair to pastors everywhere, it's a blind spot. I don't know too many pastors who know that about themselves and go, hi, I'm codependent and emotionally unhealthy and unaware. Like, that's it. It's a blind spot. Therefore, it speaks to the need to be in relationship, authentic, transparent relationships with people. And the bottom line is, pastors as a whole, let alone church planters who are kind of out on their own in many cases, Pastors generally don't have that. Most pastors cannot walk into their boardroom or their staff meeting and go, guys, can we talk about something that I'm struggling with in my life? That's just not a safe place for a pastor to have that conversation. And so, as Dale, back coming full circle to this conversation about training up church planters, that needs to be a part of that process. Yes, they need ancient languages. Yes, they need some leadership chops, but they also need someone looking into their emotional health of their life outside of pastoral leadership.
I have a friend named Dan Leanne who made this quote, and I actually put it in the book installed, that in the chapter or the section about approval addiction. And Dan basically says this: if you go into ministry to gain the approval of people, you will eventually be slaughtered by their disapproval.
Wow. Yeah.
And I just, that when we were having coffee when he told me that, and I thought, that's what's happening. And so I guess the reason I wanted to have this podcast conversation is I'm concerned that we're just throwing people out there off the deep end, unprepared. And so our conversation, Jason and our conversation that morning, if you remember, Jason, I started saying, well, maybe we need to start doing church planners the way this guy in the Bible named Jesus did. You remember, he went and selected people, but he trained them for 3 years, and he let them do some things. And then came back and talked to me. They did this. We discussed a lot of that stuff. We sat down and talked about it. But before he just released them, and before he went on back to heaven, there was a 3-year training process. And I think, John, to your point, what happened is all that underlying stuff comes to the surface. And so what I'm bothered by, and again, I'm not Mr. Church Planner, and I'm not trying to be critical of anybody that's doing it, but I'm just concerned that we're setting people up for failure. And
So Dale, one thing about that, at least the church planters that I have interacted with over the years, and John, you kind of mentioned this, that spirit of starting new things, that entrepreneurial, spirit, a lot of times that works against wanting to go through the slow process of discipleship, of understanding, hey, I need to slow down in order to do something. And that's where, at least we're starting to get too many in our district, too many of these church planners who run out, try to start something, and then come back to us saying, okay, we got something going. Now will you fund us? And it's like, wait, we had nothing to do with how you started. And yet now you want us to come in and, and so, but they've already started. And so you reach that point of going, I'm not sure how I can help you. And if I start just funding you, I'm funding an unhealthy situation, and no one is there to really speak truth in. So I do think churches need to be the entities that plant, right? That send people out to plant, because you can set up a situation where they have a year, 2 years, whatever it is, of development, of trying things. And yeah, one of the questions we usually ask people is, what have you started that is still going? I'm amazed at the number of potential church planners who literally have nothing to put in that category. And yet we're going to hand them a bunch of money and the spiritual life of people and say, well, let's try it on you, see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I'll kind of muddy the waters with this and mess with everybody's thinking. What if we took the money away? I mean, what if we said you need to plant churches, but there's no money to be had? This isn't a job. You don't get a salary and a paycheck. You've got to figure out a way to do this. Because let me back up. Here's another theme about church planting, going back to the Jesus model that Dale mentioned. I don't think any of those 11 disciples, we know one of them checked out, right? But the other 11, I don't think any of them were like, hey, I'm ready for church planting now. Where do I start? They all felt unprepared. And Jesus checks out. They're kind of standing around staring at each other like, now what? So the principle I want to draw from that is, I think in church planting, if you're doing it right, you're going to feel unprepared. I've kind of am a little leery of the church planter that, steps out of his training saying, I'm ready now, bring it on. Like, you're not, you're always going to have that sense of I'm not ready, which leads us to a posture of dependency and on our knees before God, asking him to do what only he can do, which is grow his church. So there's a tension there, between being completely untrained and and starting too quickly versus having this idea of, well, I'm ready for it now because I'm quote unquote trained. Like, are you? His disciples didn't really feel prepared, and so I don't know. I wrestle with that. Like, what if we didn't see it as a job where there's money to be had? What if you had to plant a church and see this thing grow from the ground up and there wasn't a bunch of money coming at you? Like, it's possible. It happens all over the world, but somehow in the United States, we've made it. We spend a lot of money getting a church off the ground, and I'm coming to question a lot of that. Like, is that, and one last thing I'll add to that, in my 17 years of being in a multi-site church, we weren't planting independent churches much of the time. It was just campuses of our church, but it's the principles are very much the same. In that brief period of time, I saw the culture is changing, right? Like, hopefully we all can agree on that. The tactics that we used to start our church back in 2004 did not work when we tried to launch another campus in 2016 or 17. Like, in that brief period of time, I recognized some of this idea of, man, let's just open our doors, start a worship service, have great music, good preaching, and a church will grow. Not so much in our culture today. That worked in a few decades back in a largely Christian society. That is not the world that most of our church planters are planting churches in. And so I had a missionary friend one time that just challenged me on that. He said, John, in the United States, you guys do it totally backwards from how we do it. He said, you go out and you start your big Sunday service that requires a lot of machinery and money to get it going. And then from there, you start looking at how to break people into small groups. And then from there, you talk about the need to disciple people one-on-one. He said, where I'm at, we do it the exact opposite. We start with one-on-one discipleship, which then leads to a network of small cell groups. And then and only then do we gather for a big worship service. It sounds kind of biblical when he lays it out like that, and it makes me look at what we're doing in the church in the United States today and go, man, we're doing some stuff really backwards. So anyway.
Yeah, John, though, here's the thing. If Jesus had launched stuff in America in the 21st century, he would have done it the way we're doing it, right?
Yeah, right. Probably. I bet if I knew ancient languages, I could find that in there, Jason, but I don't, so I can't answer that question.
That's why I'm saying it. I've got the degree. So no, that's the thing, is the metrics that we have created to decide whether or not a church plant or a church in general is a success have everything to do with, gatherings, numbers, budgets. Every set of metrics that I've seen involves something about being self-governing and self-sustaining. Like, that's when we say, okay, this church plant has made it. They've reached those two, milestones. But I mean, I don't think you have to know the ancient languages to realize that I don't think Jesus ever said, go build self-governing, self-sustaining churches with cool music and, pastors that can really entertain people. I think he said, go make disciples.
That's right.
I got nothing else. That's just,
I just like settling in that moment for a second, because I believe there's this huge shift happening before our eyes. I don't believe necessarily that the Lord caused COVID and the pandemic, but I do believe he's redeeming it. And I believe, I wrote an article a few weeks ago called 7 years in 7 weeks. I believe we, in just a short period of time, we've advanced to where we would have been, and we've discovered that there's a lot that we got to work on. And so, as we kind of move toward landing the plane, one of the things I think about is that this shift is happening, and how we do church, and there's a longing in the hearts of people to be connected. There's a longing in the hearts of people to not just be entertained. The truth of the gospel is just as true today and just as alive today as it has ever been. The impact of what the Lord wants to do with there's nothing wrong with the church. No. Jesus's church. There's nothing wrong with Jesus's church, but there may be some things wrong with our church. And what I mean by that is if you, and it goes with the personality of the entrepreneur, but if you go in, a lot of entrepreneurs like to start things, they just don't know how to finish them. And if you start a church, but you don't finish a church, sometimes, it leaves people worse than they came into it. And so that, we do need to reflect and think things through a little bit. What is the heartbeat behind what we're doing? We want to change the world. The church is alive. The church is well. The church, and look, there is no plan B. This is it. This is what he left us with. He left us with this. Carolee, did you have a question there?
I don't think so.
Okay, good. I thought you leaned in there. We'll edit that out. So here's what I want to do, guys, as we kind of wrap this up. I've got 3 takeaways from our conversation today. The first one is that you guys have said this is to be a church planter, you need a divine call. So there needs to be a calling to do that. The second thing is there needs to be a need in the community. In other words, we don't just need to plant a church somewhere that doesn't, and I'm not saying that everywhere doesn't need a church, but Jason, when you guys planted your church in Delaware, there was a specific need because there needed to be a church there. And then the third thing you guys said is that the person doing it needs the right motive. So I want to go to you guys, and John, I'll start with you, and then Jason. When you think about potential church planners that are listening right now, people who feel like maybe that's what God's calling them to do, as we wrap up the podcast, what is one word of encouragement or advice or wisdom or just that you would leave with someone today if they feel like they've got this burning in their heart to start a church? What would you say to them? Jason, I'm going to ask you the same thing.
Well, that's a good word, a burning in your heart. The words that I used to describe it was a holy discontent. It was a holy restlessness in my life where I was starting to have this lack of contentment with things that I had always wanted. I had this job in the fire service, and now I saw that God was starting to cut those heartstrings loose in me, and I couldn't fully explain it. So I want to affirm that if anyone's listening to that, based on what I said earlier about running from the call and all of that, I don't want you to feel like, man, there must be something wrong with me if I want to be a church planter or be involved in pastoral ministry. Listen, if God's working in your heart, lean into that, lean into that stirring and that discontent, and just know this, Dale, the things you said a minute ago, number 1 and number 2 are connected. That divine call is going to come out of a need. God is going to connect you to that place of need in the world where he has shaped you to step in and serve. And so trust his guidance and his leadership in that. The problem with the church planting wiring, if you will, and Jason's already alluded to this, and I'm going to put me in that we is we have a tendency to get out in front of God and rush the process and hurry it along because we're action takers. Entrepreneurs are doers. We don't just sit and wait. And that's good at times, but that also can get us in trouble. So my word of encouragement and affirmation to that person that is sensing that stirring in their heart is feed it, lean into that, but also wait on God to just guide and direct and show you the path forward, because he will. And if you're doing it completely alone, you're doing it wrong. I'll say that again. If you're doing it completely alone, you're doing it wrong. I don't care how you do it. If you're part of a denomination, if you're a part of a coaching group, have a sending church that's behind you, you need some form of team that is around you, speaking into your life, knowing what's going on, and looking over your shoulder. And if that sounds like something you're not willing to do, that ought to be a huge red flag on the dashboard of your soul, because it's saying to me, you don't want accountability or having transparency in front with someone looking over your shoulder like that. So that is for your benefit, pastor and church planters, to have people in your life that know you, that are in your business and love you enough to be able to tell you the honest truth. And you need that, whether they're a part of your church or a part of a team somewhere removed from that. You have to have a team if you're going to be a church planter. So there's my words of encouragement, Dale.
Jason, what would you say? Words of encouragement, wisdom, or just advice?
Run, don't do it. No. I would, just building off what John just said, the first thing I thought of was build a community of people around you to process the call, not necessarily a launch team, not necessarily, in that, but get some people around you and give them the opportunity to speak truth into your life, saying, yes, we affirm, or, hey, let's step back and think through this calling again. John, I think you nailed it. That's so vital in what's going on. And I would go back to make sure you know why you're doing it. Make sure that you have really pressed down and asked that why question 6 or 7 times. Why do I do this? Why do I want to? Why that? Because if it's not about being obedient, being faithful, and making disciples, then you're going to run out of steam, or you're going to hit some things that are going to just trip you up. And so those are kind of the words of encouragement. But I would also say, you know what? If God's moving in your life, look back and see, are there other examples of times where I was able to start something? I was able to do something because God called me and I was obedient. And if there's none, then definitely start small. Don't try to plant the next mega church tomorrow. Start small and say, okay, God, I'm going to prove that I am faithful in these small things so that God will give me more things. And I think it's in Zechariah talks about don't be disheartened by the beginnings of these small things, but know that God is at work. And that's I took a lot of, it gave me a lot of strength when I would go back and read that passage to know, even in the small things, God is at work, and know that if God has called you, he's doing something, even if it's just in you. And if, as long as you pursue faithfulness, then God will worry about the results.
That's so good.
Jason, I actually kind of wanted to touch on that mission and vision thing really quick. You've mentioned that a couple of times, that you had wished that somebody had asked you about your why when you first started. How important do you think it is to have that mission and vision at the forefront of your church plant? And what would you say to people who are thinking about this and, kind of how to craft that mission and vision and how to keep it, in the center of what you're doing?
Well, you should go to the one-day seminar by 95 Network.
I didn't mean to do that, but there you go.
And honestly, we do have, there are resources on the website where you can look at some teachings and stuff on that. And it is good. But I think it's vital, because if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, then anything that comes at you could distract you from what needs to be done, because you don't know how to say no to things. You don't know how to focus on what is most important. And I would even throw in there, your values have to be part of that too. You have to understand what's important to you. That's one thing I ran into over and over is my values. I knew what they were, but when situations got difficult, there were times that my values were in conflict with each other. And I had to decide which value was more important than the other, because I could only, really pursue one. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't ready to make those kind of discernments in what I was doing. So you have to have that down so much that it just flows out of who you are. The old saying, if it's confusing when you're standing in the pulpit, that it's completely confusing to everyone in the congregation. And so you have to have that down so much, because everything else will be distracting to you if you aren't focused on the thing that you need to get done.
Gotcha.
That's so good. Thank you both for being with us today, for talking about this. If you are listening and you're thinking, wow, they're really trying to discourage us. No, we're not. We're just trying to make you understand the why of what you're doing, because we don't want you to fail. We don't want to set you up for failure. And that was kind of what motivated me to want to have this conversation today is I want you to know why you're doing what you're doing. I want you to know that you've been called of God to do it. I want you to know you've been equipped to do it. And so we want you to plant churches. The Lord knows we need churches, but we need healthy churches. And that's one of our main focal points of 95 Network is before, we want you to grow numerically, because that means you're reaching more people, but we want you to be healthy. And so guys, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank y'all so much.
You've been awesome. Great answers. And we'll do this again sometime.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks, Dale. Thanks, Carol Lee.
Oh, thank you guys for coming. Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.